Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay Holloway, Executive Director at Atlantic Live, the Atlantic's Events Division. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our Atlantic Exchange, of course, with Kati Marton here. Kati, as you all well know, is an award-winning author and journalist, and we've gathered tonight to delve into her latest book, True Believer. It's the story of former State Department official Noel Field, who Kati calls the ultimate anti-hero. Field's career at the State Department was off to a brilliant start, but took an unpredictable turn when he was recruited by the Soviet Union as a spy in the 1930s. It's a suspenseful episode in history. And in the context of our contemporary conversations on national security, Field's story illuminates fresh insight into ISIS and true believers being recruited by foreign powers today. Kati's here tonight to talk to the Atlantic's Washington editor at large, Steve Clemons. But a few notes before we begin. Please tweet your comments at Atlantic_live. That's our hashtag, Atlantic_live. And use the hashtag ATLX. After the conversation, we'll make sure that we have lots of time for your questions. And of course, Allison with Kramer Books is here as well, and she'll have books on sale. And Kati will stick around for signings once we wrap up. With that, a welcome again to Kati first, and of course to Steve Clemons to lead the conversation. Steve, to you.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. And I tell you, it's a real event when you have a hashtag. I'm going to end my editorial objectivity right here and just say without a doubt, I got the galleys of this thanks to Kati quite early in the process, and I was flying to all places, but I was flying to Vienna and then going to be driven to Bratislava, Slovakia for a global security conference. And lo and behold, Bratislava pops up in the book as an interesting place where this spy, Noel Field, was detained, basically kidnapped, if you will, and then taken. And it's an extraordinary book, not only for the tale it tells, but, and I'm just going to, if I would write endorsement, extraordinary research that would not have happened without a lot of these various files in the former Soviet Union, in Hungary, and others coming forward. And also Kati's imprint as a child of having met through her parents, who were distinguished journalists for AP and UPI, operating as the last journalist in a free Hungary, and then the last journalist in an unfree Hungary, who were jailed, who had this thing. And then her extraordinary, if any of you know Kati, how many of you actually are friends with Kati? I'm going to look at Gail here and so there's nobody more persistent in getting what she wants than Kati Marton.
Is that a compliment?
It's a big compliment. And when you look at the family members that she reached, if you look at the research, it's an extraordinary story. So first I want to compliment Kati on this. And I want to begin with a set of questions. We're going to have a little bit of an exchange here, and then we're going to go to all of you, because you can have questions as significant as mine. But can you basically frame for us why Noel Field, whom I had never heard about, he's sort of the least known, most interesting spy in American history, in my view. We know about Alger Hiss, we know about Whittaker Chambers. Yeah. I don't think very many people know about Noel Field, but I have to tell you that I was shocked that there was this segment of history I hadn't heard. How did you find it? Why did you write it? Why do you think we have a blind spot about him?
Yeah. Well, first of all, good evening. And as you see, these are actually people who are interested in the book. They're not friends. I mean, we are friends now.
No one can make a penny out of tonight. There's nothing. This is true interest.
So this is all legit.
True interest in the true believer.
Yes. But Steve, first of all, I want to thank you for hosting this, and you're a wonderful friend to me. You were a wonderful friend to.
If it was a crappy book, I wouldn't be hosting this tonight.
Okay. So it is. I'm not sure that makes a blurb. This is not a crappy book. But thank you.
It's a fantastic book.
Thank you, and you've been a great supporter of it, as you have of many of my past efforts, and your friendship is very meaningful to me, as it was to Richard. So if I have an MO, a modus operandi, it is to find obscure characters and through them paint a larger tableau, if you will. I did this in my first book, which was a biography of Raoul Wallenberg, who in those days no one had heard of, and through Wallenberg I told the larger tale of the Hungarian Holocaust. I did this with the Polk conspiracy, which is the story of George Polk, the assassination of the CBS correspondent, who until then was known only as the Polk Award, a highly esteemed prize. And so on. I don't want to. I'd love to actually list all my books, but
we
you
only
get the
have one for sale tonight.
Right. Yeah. So you get the idea. Obscure character through whom I tell the larger tale. I had this remarkable piece of good fortune with Noel Field. In that there was this bizarre family connection that my father was actually in the same cell as this American trader. My father was in that cell in this maximum security prison in Budapest, having been convicted as a CIA agent for the crime, as Steve said,
just
of
mention
being
who
a
your
good
father
reporter.
Was.
His name was Andre Marton, and actually he was known in Washington as one of the great diplomatic correspondents. After we escaped from Hungary in the late 50s, we eventually ended up here in Washington, and he became the AP's senior diplomatic correspondent. So, for 2 years he was in this horrible confinement. And not only was he in the same cell as this man, but he had the same interrogator. I had forgotten that when my father came out of prison, obviously we're talking decades, and I was a little kid, but he did tell us that, when he was freed right before the Hungarian Revolution, that his jailer, when leading my dad to his cell, said, "Congratulations, you got the VIP cell," which did not mean Danube view. It meant more surveillance equipment than any other, having recently been vacated by the American agent Noel Field. It's an unusual name. It's stuck in my brain. And
can we just stop there just for a second? I just want to do a poll. How many of you have heard of Noel Field before tonight? Gail,
Good.
you did, because you know. Yeah, I mean, but I mean, I just want to. This is very important, because when we go forward and you learn a little bit about Noel Field, and how Stalin used him, it's shocking that I didn't know.
Because he was actually.
Why wasn't it an Atlantic cover story? I want to know.
Really, but it's not too late. He really. I am shameless. He really played a major role in the Cold War. He was, and we're going to get to that, how this came to pass, but he played, he was Stalin's chief witness to prosecute Stalin's enemies during Stalin's last most paranoid gasp. By now, he is fully convinced that everybody is his enemy, and so he has this American true believer who has been working loyally as his spy, working for the KGB. And by the way, much of the story takes place right here, because he was in the State Department.
Not in the Watergate. That's for other stories.
No. He was in the old State Building, actually.
But pretty close.
But but to return to your question about how it is that we didn't know about Noel Field and that we don't study this case in our history books, it is this very fact that he had been kidnapped by the KGB, himself a KGB agent, let me emphasize that bit of irony, and then he disappeared, never to emerge from behind the Iron Curtain except for one press interview. One of the conditions of his release after 5 brutal years was that he never talked to American media, and that his sanctuary was breached by 2 journalists, my mother and father. So that was the other kind of remarkable coincidence.
Give us a quick sketch, sort of shorter form than long, of Noel Field's life in the State Department, and also what I found so interesting, was his life after the State Department, particularly with the Spanish Civil War.
Yes.
In how was it Quaker groups or Universal Church groups?
Well, he was a Quaker,
Yeah.
but he then well, just to compress the story, and please cut me off because once I get
But
going,
I just want to say that,
yes.
but he saved communists and he
He
didn't
saved
save
communists
non-communists.
right. Now we're in the Spanish Civil War, which is a hinge event in the book and actually in the 20th century. Spain was the first chance that the West had to stop bemoaning the rise of fascism and to actually do something about it. But we, particularly the United States, were absolutely on the sidelines, letting it unfold. Kind of, I'm sorry to say this, very much as we are allowing Syria to implode without much intervention. Spain was the equivalent of Syria and looked very much the way Aleppo does today. Noel Field, by now, he's quit the State Department. He always had some minimal scruples about spying on his own country. I emphasize minimal because he continued doing it. But once he got an offer from the League of Nations, he bolted from New York, went to Geneva, and it was on behalf of the League of Nations that he was in Spain trying to rescue. Franco is now triumphant, and all these volunteers, including thousands of American volunteers, are looking for a way out of Spain, and Noel Field is in charge of producing safe passage for them. Then he goes to work for the Unitarians,
Right.
and he turns the Unitarians' charity towards refugees into what he Noel Field calls Red Aid. So on the Unitarians' dime, he is rescuing hundreds, perhaps thousands, of die-hard communists in Spain to help defeat Franco, to return to their home countries and begin to set up Soviet satellites for the post-war. So all this, unbeknownst to the Unitarians in Boston, who keep sending him money to save people, but in fact,
He was saving the future Soviet state, which interestingly then became the map for Stalin's paranoia. And so those people he saved became purged.
Suspect. Because Stalin, as I said, in late life, in advanced paranoia, didn't trust anyone who had been exposed to the West, who had been exposed to foreigners, including this guy, Noel Field, his loyal servant, who simply didn't understand. There were many things he didn't understand. One of the takeaways from this book is that it isn't enough in life to want to do good, as he did. You also need to have judgment, which he lacked.
Do you know, there's so many, this book has so many different contours and corners of it, and I actually haven't told you anything that's giving away the end. It's such a great story.
Thank you.
But part of this, I want to get into the ideological dimensions of his commitment, which seems so perverse, because he ended up defecting to the country that terrorized and jailed him, right? And tortured him, and his wife, to whom he was devoted, and she was devoted. And they adopted a kind of daughter in an odd relationship.
She's the heroine of this
Yeah, she's
book.
the incredible heroine, and she lived over here in Virginia.
Yes.
And so, again, take us into that muck of someone, because and I think that, as you just referenced to sort of the rise of fascism, though you talk about Syria, I talk about the rise of fascism everywhere else in response to a lot of other things. But I am interested in what it takes to become completely radicalized in favor of cause. Because when you get into this story of this guy, which I really recommend, you buy 7 copies and distribute them in the holidays. Whatever holiday you may enjoy, it works in every genre. That when you get into the story and you look at the contradictions he hosted in his mind.
Yes.
Because we're now dealing with an era of radicalization again.
Right. And as with ISIS recruits, the radicalization began. He self-radicalized at the outset. He felt alienated from his own country. A situation very similar to what we face today. We're talking about the 30s. The country was really deeply divided, 11 million unemployed, and a generation of young people, many of them having just received the finest education. My anti-hero went through a 4-year course at Harvard in 2 years, so he was a brilliant man. But the tableau of injustice, racial injustice that confronted him upon graduation, the execution of a pair of Italian immigrants, Sacco and Vanzetti. Does that? Yes, this is such a well-educated group. You all know about Sacco and Vanzetti. That was probably the key event in Noel Field's radicalization. He wept the night of their execution, and many years later, when he was in the same cell as my dad, he wrote that was the night that he basically became not only a communist but a hardcore Stalinist, which means pretty much willing to do anything that was asked of him, including murder. So that's how it started, and of course, unbeknownst to him, Moscow was Moscow's talent scouts in Washington were looking for young men such as Noel Field, well-educated, very presentable, the sort of young man who no one would ever say he must be a spy. Well-spoken, well-dressed. Kim Philby is very much of the same type. And so when the talent scout came knocking on his door in the shape of a kind of a Raymond Chandler heroine, Hedy Massing, the former Viennese actress who was a recruiter for the KGB, he was ready to start talking. And that is the astonishing thing, is that this man living here with everything ahead of him was willing to betray his country, his family, his certainly his career for a country that he'd never even set foot in, that he knew only from the propaganda, which was masterful because Lenin was basically the inventor of modern spin.
So let me tell you why I love the book so much. And I don't know if you did this consciously or it was part of your craft. It's not just a condemnation of Noel Field. You actually take us into the construct of how he looked at the world and what he prioritized, what his weights were. And while you were ultimately condemning him, you nonetheless helped us understand him. And he actually came out as a kind of pathetic figure. And I understood the other side more than I've ever understood when it comes to spycraft and these things. And I'm interested in whether or not in your research you ever found, was there a Noel Field on their side, on our side? To sort of look at, there's one side to say, hey, they're a totalitarian state and we're free, and they were able to transform this guy. But what about the reverse?
Well, for fans of the Americans, yes, those are his counterparts.
How do you get those extra episodes? We'll have to talk.
And I must say that when the producers of the Americans wrote to me saying, in fact, it's on the jacket cover, the endorsement from the Americans saying, this book is helping our new season. I felt that to be almost as high praise as Steve Clemons saying this is a great book, because yes, I did not research the Noel Field, the Soviet Noel Fields living among us, but that is in fact what the subject of the Jennings couple who live in suburban Washington, the fictional couple, how we can be so deceived by the spies next door. And
anybody want to raise their hand here?
just among us. You can feel free to come clean. But the uniqueness of Noel Field is that, yes, there were many disenchanted young Americans, most intellectuals in the 30s, from Dos Passos to Edmund Wilson to obviously George Orwell, Alger Hiss, so on. But Noel Field, his depth for him, communism became a faith. It became much more than a political conviction. It provided him with an overarching explanation for every damn thing in the world, and therefore it was sort of like an addiction. Very hard to imagine life without that. The person who best explains the power of that captive mind is Arthur Koestler, my fellow Hungarian, who went through the same conversion, but unlike Noel Field, he saw the light. Once he went to the Soviet Union and traveled in the Soviet Union, the result of that trip was darkness at noon. But Noel Field, who not only went to the Soviet Union, but became Stalin's prisoner, emerges from, as you said, from prison, from torture, and still believes because he needs to believe, because he has nothing left in life. He has betrayed everyone.
Until the last moment.
Yes, yes. I found people in Budapest who knew him after prison. He died early because of course he was physically broken by prison. So he died in his 60s, and his colleagues at the journal where he worked in Budapest thought that he was 20 years older. But they said that he was crushed. He condoned the Hungarian the suppression of the Hungarian Revolution. Thought that was a good move on the part of the Soviets. But when the Warsaw Pact tanks rolled into Prague, a city that he knew very well and loved, in fact, the book opens in Prague with his kidnapping. That was a bridge too far, and he stopped paying his party dues then. But he never publicly condemned Stalinism or his own role, which was pretty terrifying in working for such a brutal dictator. He never distanced himself from that. And what we haven't mentioned is that the people who were his prime victims were his own family. He absolutely crushed his own loving American family.
The other part of the book that haunts me a little bit is your brilliant depiction of the sophistication of the infrastructure of that state, the spying. He and his wife were in the same prison and didn't know it.
Yes.
And I have to tell you, and many people will not be pleased that I say this, what came to my mind was Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, rendition. I happen to have a very close relationship that I think many people don't know with your husband, Richard Holbrooke. He was as disturbed by these dimensions of the national security state here. And I'm just wondering, as you wrote this, did any of these contemporary commitments to infrastructure of dealing with people kind of off budget, if you will, like the Soviets used to do and may still do with the Russians, did that enter into your mind?
Of course, yes. And well, first of all, I think that if you become a state that is okay with that structure, with the Guantanamo structure, if you become a state that condones torture, for whatever good reason, you it soaks into your humanity. It's very hard to come back from that, and we are seeing that now in the former, what used to be called the captive nations of Europe. I'm a product of one of those captive nations. And we are seeing that the roots of democracy there are so shallow. One by one, they're heading rightward toward populism, starting with Viktor Orban, the extremist right-wing leader of my country of Hungary, but
tell us a little bit more about Orban.
Orban.
What do you really think?
Well, I'm revealing no secrets. He and I used to be on fairly good terms. I hosted him in my apartment at a dinner when he was a promising young communist. By the way, his Oxford education was paid for by George Soros. So,
That's a tweetable comment, by the way. That fits under 140 spaces.
We all got that wrong, but he started off with great promise, and guess what? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And this man does not want to ever leave power, and so he's willing to, like Slobodan Milosevic, pretty much, or Bashar al-Assad, do pretty much anything that it takes to stay in power. But the neighborhood is going that way, left and right, and from east to west. So, God forbid that we should be heading in that direction. And to be honest with you, Steve, since the in the 30 years that I've spent in this country, this is the first time that I have a knot of anxiety in the pit of my stomach. And I'm kind of glad that my parents, who brought me to this country, and who were the most patriotic Americans, as only refugees can be, I'm kind of glad that they're not around right now, and in a way, I'm glad Richard isn't either.
Did Richard? I mean, this book must have taken you years to research, and I have to tell you, it doesn't read like a well-researched book. You can. I mean this as a compliment. It reads like a better than Le Carré novel that is richly researched, and so it's not filled with that kind of stodginess of a footnote on every corner. But you realize when you get into it, it is. And I'm sort of interested in. Did Richard know this book was in you? Did he comment on it? Did he?
Alas, no. He was alive, and let me just fully thank you and acknowledge what you just said, because that is precisely my goal in writing, is to tell a great narrative. I'm a storyteller. I research the hell out of a subject, but I put it in the back so that it doesn't break up the narrative flow, because quite frankly, I think history is too important to be left to historians. I think we all need to know history. I'm not going to repeat that cliche about if we don't, we're doomed to blah, 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 but you know what I'm saying.
But this came after Richard passed.
This came after Richard, but he was alive when I wrote Enemies of the People, my family's journey to America, and he was a great supporter of that book. But
did he know of Noel Field?
No.
Really?
No.
So,
but he was familiar with the.
Isn't it like required if you become a State Department employee, like Richard was, that you've got to know about the other spies
but I don't
of the
think
State Department?
I think this is. I'm happy to take some credit here and say that I've kind of introduced not the most shining example of a State Department alum, but one that should be known as a cautionary tale, and not that we need to get paranoid about who the guy in the next in the next office is, but that but that there were signs, and that this man was deeply alienated, and looking for an alternate.
As I read your book, everyone saw the signs and purposely wanted to ignore them.
And this is
Am
very
I
human.
wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, and same with Philby. He was quote unquote one of us, and you don't want to. The mind boggles at the notion that such a man from such a family with such an education, whose forefathers came here in the 17th century from Yorkshire, would betray his country. But it happened, and probably continues to happen.
I want to go to all of you in a moment, but I want you to go back to the heroine of this.
Oh, yes,
because,
please.
you know, again, what you read in this book in the time, and of course I didn't live in this time, and I don't know if others did. I never presume anyone's age. But, I mean, you met the former president of Hungary that was killed, and others that were Hungarian superstars that were killed during the revolt, and others. But
yes,
it's
in the book too. I was 6 years old, and my mother had just been.
You met him on the
released
trolley.
Yeah, and Imre Nagy. You're referring to Imre Nagy, the hero of the Hungarian Revolution, who was later kidnapped by the Soviets. They do that well. He got on the trolley. I was sitting on my mother's lap, and no, sorry, he was seated. We got on the trolley, and he got up, and gave my mother and me, the little kid on her lap, his place, and said to my mother very meaningfully, "What happened to you and your husband," my father was still in prison, "should never have happened." And this was a very prominent communist leader who was about to become the head of the country during the revolution. So there were good communists too.
Back to the heroine.
Yes.
One of the things that fascinated me about everyone around her and that time was the slippery moral compass that everyone had.
Yes.
How did she become such a
remarkable?
You know, she had such backbone. She had such clarity in that
Yes.
time. She was such a young girl. She was adopted by the Fields, and
In Spain.
after the revolution came through this, she got, and the other thing about the story, which I'll tell you why it's so good, everyone that knew Noel Field, everyone that was related to Noel Field, everyone who had a connection with Noel Field got jailed and tortured. Just everybody.
Yeah.
Brothers who went looking for him, and who were all innocent. And these were Americans.
Right.
But then she ends up over in Virginia. She's got a family. So just a quick snapshot, because I want to go to the audience. But
Right.
who is she? Why is she?
Yeah.
I guess why is she in that maelstrom of things that happened? She was an extraordinary personality when everyone else, including her parents, his parents. I mean, it was just weird.
Yes, well, she paid massively for her backbone and her courage because she went looking for her adoptive father, who had disappeared, and Washington was not raising hell with the Kremlin to find out what happened to, not only what happened to him, but as Steve said, to his wife and to his brother. Who all disappeared, and Erica, who had just fallen in love and married an American GI. She was German.
Had children.
And had two little ones. Handed the babies over to the GI and said, "I'm going to go find this man. I owe him that. He saved me from the Civil War." And for her trouble, she was rewarded with a one-way ticket to the northernmost outpost of the Gulag Archipelago, laying railroad tracks in Vorkuta. And anybody who read Solzhenitsyn knows about Vorkuta. Anyway, after 5 years, Stalin is now dead. Khrushchev and Eisenhower are making nice, and prisoners, political prisoners, are released. But here is where we learn that that the U.S. in the 50s was not such a bright and shining symbol of freedom and democracy either. They would not allow this woman who had paid massively, who had demonstrated her anti-communism by being Stalin's captive, they wouldn't let her in because she had been contaminated by exposure to Stalin, and maybe she was herself a spy. So for 2 years, she couldn't get a visa to the U.S. She was kept waiting in Berlin. So a cruel time, and
The Muslim of her time.
well, yes, yes. I mean, you raise that the role of refugees in this book is also a powerful sub-theme, because one of the reasons that young idealists such as Noel Field, before he became a cold-blooded spy/assassin, he was an idealist who was dismayed by the fact that the U.S. during the Holocaust was tightening its quotas against refugees. And this was so deeply against the grain of what these young people felt America should be about, and sent them looking for an alternate ideology. And they landed on the wrong one, communism. So yes, there's so many parallels between the 30s and now, I'm sorry to tell
And
you.
she lived over here in Virginia.
Yes,
She got back.
in Middleburg, Hun Country. She lived. I'm happy to say, she had.
And you're in touch with her family?
Yes,
Are
yes.
they
Yeah, they've been
taken with the
tremendously.
story?
Yes, yes. I'm surprised none of them are here tonight because they tend to show up at Washington events. They're very happy to. They didn't know the story. And same with Noel Field's brothers' kids. Part of the reason that they cooperated
I love
with
Noel
me.
Field's brother in this book, but he's so naive. I mean,
Yeah.
he's so
Yeah.
naive. Isn't he so naive?
He's yeah. Well, he was a Quaker, and he's, he was one of those people who just couldn't
He's a
believe.
good guy.
Yeah, he couldn't believe that there was such a thing as evil in the world, and I'm sorry to tell you there is.
Let me open up to all of you, and then we'll start. Yes, right here. And do we need a mic? How are we doing this? Okay, great. This is Stacy Berger, by everyone, and she deserves a round of applause now. Yeah.
Yay,
So,
Stacy.
yeah.
Hi, I do look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
Question I have is, how do you feel about Mr. Trump's reaction to Fidel Castro's death and President Obama's reaction, and also the reaction of a significant portion of the mainstream media, which at worst I would say that they would non-negative reaction
Or
to
Justin
Castro.
Trudeau.
Praise, praise. How do you react to that?
Thank you. Great question.
Yeah.
Kati?
So, just judging by your question, you clearly feel that the reaction should be more tempered and more negative than it is. That this was one of the.
negative than
Yeah.
history will be the judge of Fidel Castro.
Yes,
based on
when
what
we-
know, and concern about a media that has so much praise
Yes.
for this fellow,
Yeah.
and if you can distinguish between Castro and Stalin,
Yeah.
that also would be.
Yeah. Well, I think partly a couple of things. One, I hate to. I am of the media myself. Was for many years a journalist before I became an author. I hate to say this about my colleagues, but there's so little historic background or sense of events. I mean. It's like everything is happening for the first time. This is what I mean about how history is too important to be left in history books. We need to know these things. I imagine that some of the people writing those eulogies about a really hardcore authoritarian, cold-blooded dictator. Really don't understand what his history is.
Andrea Mitchell.
Yeah, well, she's a very fine journalist, we were competitors once upon a time, so I don't want to say anything negative about a really, really good reporter. But in general, I think if you live as long as Castro, it kind of, you get a better shot at good obits, because he seemed like a very weak old guy. Hard to believe that such a frail 90-year-old could ever have committed those heinous crimes. And plus, we are making overtures toward quote unquote normalization of relations, and I think people people don't have historic memories.
I
really.
think, if I may
Yeah.
editorialize here, I think that the truth is, and the truth that should be told is, there are many Castros.
Yeah.
There are a whole variety of Castros that each one is a monster, but one is not a monster all the time. There are
But if
others
you're a
that have
monster-
universal health care. So
If you're a monster, part
yeah.
of the time you're a monster, in my
right,
view. So,
right. No,
yeah,
but I think that being
Yeah.
a monster, having that story told, is important.
Yeah.
I also think it's important, just it is as I hear observers of 1950s America tell our story in Latin America, and all the other kind of identity issues that were going on in Latin America vis-a-vis the United States. That's also an important part of the story. So I don't want to forgive or normalize the kind of whitewashing of Castro, but as someone who'd been down to Cuba, and I myself opposed and found that embargo ineffective, I had to think very, I have a relationship with Liana Rose-Leighton and others who've been critics, and I deal with them, and we have mutual respect, but there is a full story. I think it's a great question, because you see these different faces of leaders, and they produce different results, and telling these stories. And it's why I like this book, love this book so much, because you really do get a frame of how this individual looked back at his own country and betrayed his own country, and why. And I don't think it's justified in any way at all, but I think it's useful to see what that frame is, and to tell those stories. Yes, right here.
I was just going to say, I would put Castro in now
Yeah.
versus Castro and Stalin. That's all.
Oh,
Hi, I guess
Yeah.
I'm speaking. Hugh Grindstaff. I would compare Castro and Stalin,
And
Mao,
Mao.
because of the social change that went on in
Yes.
China and the social change that went on in Cuba.
I think too, Americans like a simpler storyline, and everything is black and white, and good guys, bad guys, and most people don't fall into either of those categories all the time. Castro certainly didn't.
Yes,
but
Tim?
we like to simplify things.
Tim?
You made a couple of references to Kim Philby, and I'm very much looking forward to reading this. But you would be one of 50 biographers of Philby. What's the difference, and what is the cultural kind of rejection? Because to the extent that the British spy system seems to have kept Philby in the mix, and it's reflective of who they were, he's still looking at cricket scores.
Yes.
And has a subscription to the Times through the rest of his life in Moscow. It's almost as if he's
Yes.
just moved over. Why is there such a difference in terms of Noel Field?
Well, good question. Philby's a fascinating character, but far more cynical than Noel Field, who was really a Quaker idealist at the outset. Philby, I think, had a deep-seated animosity toward his own country. Neither my guy Field nor Philby spied for money, so that's one thing they had in common. No money was ever exchanged, so they had their convictions. I think that both missed their own countries. One of the ways that Noel Field kept sane in prison was in trying to reconstruct the map of the United States, and with all the state capitals, from west to east and north to south. So that was one way that he that was his kind of cricket score sheet that Philby used. But they were the same generation, the same disenchanted generation of the 30s, exposed to the worst of their own societies, and then exposed to the brilliant sales pitch coming from the Kremlin. So there were many points in common, and both of them were protected by their own class as quote unquote one of us.
Yes, right back here. It'd be so much more efficient if I just went down the line of guys, but you
In
don't.
your comments, you've mentioned the art of propaganda. You've mentioned political ideology as religion. Are there cautionary parallels between Stalin's Russia and the United States of today?
Absolutely. That's one reason why I hope people read this book, is that then too, there were quick fixes promised, and you just don't change society that fast and that simply, and of course the Soviet manipulation of American politics then is also you don't have to look far to see how involved Moscow was in this election. So, plus ça change.
Yes, right here.
If Noel Field had been alive today, and we'll say he would have been contemporary to Edward Snowden, what would have been his reaction to or opinion of Edward Snowden?
Gold star.
Yes.
Good
Come
question.
to the head of the class.
Yes.
Well, he would have been he would have been all in favor of Snowden. Snowden would have been a kindred spirit. He would have interpreted Snowden's actions as a necessary crusade against a corrupt, warped system. There's something to that.
There
I
is,
don't. Yeah. It did start a national conversation that we're still having. I don't think Snowden is anywhere near Noel Field territory in terms of core betrayal of his country. I don't approve of what he did, but he was not motivated by a need to bring down this country, which, by the way, was Noel Field's ultimate aim, was to just burn the house down.
I want to go here, but I want to ask you a quick question about Richard Holbrooke. You may recall a time I pulled up in my car and you and Richard were walking along in Georgetown, flirting and, being
Doing
all
our
cuddly
thing,
and,
yeah.
you're doing your thing. And I said, hey, and Richard had looked at me and said, Steve, I've been reading the Washington Note every day and you didn't write about that meeting we had at the State Department. I had visited the SRAP division, the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan office.
Which was his last
Richard
job.
had drilled into two of us that he had invited, and we had Joe Lieberman and Harold Cohen, some other people in the meeting, and people from all over the administration about how off the record the meeting was that we were going to see. And I said, Richard, you scared me so much. You said it was off the record. And he goes, well, it wasn't that off the record. And it just made me wonder to the degree to which Richard thought that with the power of the state and the things
Yes.
were going on, that to keep balance in an equilibrium that was healthy for society, how much of that order of the state needed to be ignored and penetrated?
Well, first of all, Richard
Is that
felt.
a fair question?
Yeah, absolutely. He was convinced that part of his job. Richard felt that part of his job, whether he was negotiating an end to the war in Bosnia, or as ambassador to the United Nations, or as President Obama's man in Afghanistan and Pakistan, his last job, he felt that the media and keeping the media informed and up to speed on whatever he was doing was actually in the national interest. Richard considered himself the explainer of foreign policy, and by the way, I don't know anybody who did it better. And I think one of the problems that we have across the board in American foreign policy is that nobody is telling us really why a sacrifice is worth it, be it in the Middle East or engaging in with any number of issues, the refugee issue. Nobody is really talking to us as adults. Richard believed that was part of his job, and you were one of those that was a necessary link to get the story out, because you were obviously very intelligent and you had a platform.
That's sweet. I just did what he said. I always took Richard's calls late at night. Yes, right here.
Thanks. I'm Charlie Clark. Was there anything in Noel Field's childhood or psychology that would tip you off that he was willing to go into his own world and own value system and just go completely against the grain from his family and country?
Yes. There. These things don't happen overnight. When he was a teenager, his father, whom he revered, also a distinguished Harvard-trained biologist, took him to the battlefields, the still fresh battlefields of World War I, Verdun and the Marne, and the scene of this unspeakable devastation of just miles and miles of graves, and said to the young Noel Field, make sure it doesn't happen again. And the father died shortly thereafter, the father who was his god and who might have played a moderating influence on this impressionable, idealistic young man, now charged with altering the course of history. And that began his radicalization. I mean, that
It's powerful.
yeah.
My friend from Romania. Up here.
Yes.
Thank you. You already stated something I wanted to say. I spent 40 years of my life in communist Romania, 22 under Ceausescu. I defected in 88, established myself in Washington in 89.
So nice to meet you.
That was so
Neighbor.
nice to meet you. So nice. What a wonderful book. And talking about true believer, in my 44 years in Romania, I've known a lot of people. I only met one true believer.
Really?
Believe me.
Who was that?
Well, actually a person who was very close to me, 20 years older, who got radicalized before the war as a very young person, and very dynamic, very revolutionary, truly. And I was afraid to talk to him because I had very different views from my family and everything, everybody else. So I would just listen. But that was the only person that I met. Not even Ceausescu's family, the kids. Not even those people believed.
No, least of all.
Least of all.
Right.
Yeah. The second thing, which is I really is extremely interesting, is this: how do they get radicalized? I have friends in France who tell me that the guy in Cannes who did that,
Yes, with the truck.
Yes, highly educated. These people coming from very rich families, with great education, great opportunities. Can you expand a little bit on that
The
and
formula for
maybe draw a
radicalization.
parallel?
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're going to end here because I want all of you to continue the conversations with Kati as you buy the 4 last books.
Oh,
and
you're
get
going to
your
have to
book signed
fight over
and
those
pay
books.
for the 3 that haven't been paid for yet. But go ahead, Kati.
I wish I could gift you these books.
No,
Yeah.
we will anyway. If you sneak away, don't worry.
Yeah, really.
Go ahead.
And I hereby announce an amnesty for book thieves. So
I know you already did. Darn it.
no, I just want people to read my book. Not anyway. So the pattern for self-radicalization. I think that there is a certain type of person who is susceptible to the siren song, be it of radical Islam or evangelical Christianity. I mean,
Right.
look at the Crusades weren't a walk in the park, and of course radical Stalinism. So and there are experts who are paid to keep a sharp eye out for such people, even before the internet. And of course now with the internet, it's infinitely easier to capture these people. When I finished writing this book last year, I thought, oh my God, who's going to pay attention to this book when all we can talk about is Trump, Trump, Trump? And so I wrote an essay, which is the very first thing in the book, called The Capture of Minds, whereby I do connect this radical movement, the one in True Believer, to the present one. And that there is human beings are susceptible to people preaching quick solutions, and perhaps that's partly at play in America today. We're looking. There are people who have sort of given up on this country's ability to do the right thing, as they had in the 30s when you had so many unemployed people, and capitalism seemed to have run out of ideas, and so we do live in kind of a dangerous moment, and it's a testing moment for us too.
Just to wrap this up for a second, but I mean, part of what also went through my mind, and I'm an independent, folks, so I'm very objective in the political race we just went through. But I know you're very close to Hillary Clinton. So when I was reading this book, I asked myself, I figured you gave a copy to Hillary, and Hillary, probably has time to read it now. And as you go through and you sort of look at the tectonic tensions of the day, what someone like a Hillary Clinton, Clinton, not necessarily her, thinks about the equities that are involved in sorting through true believers and how, and I'm just interested in what insights you have into that kind of, these questions about power and responsibility and what we do. And we've just gone through a very difficult time, and I can imagine that you were also thinking about someone like Hillary Clinton when you wrote this book.
I wasn't specifically thinking about Hillary, and obviously I think she would have been a fine president, and obviously the campaign was not everything I had hoped, but I had no clue as to what her opponent was willing to do to win. And I think that we all had a lapse of imagination. But I think for Europeans, and I'm partly European, this is a very familiar personality type, the autocratic personality. But for us Americans, it's terra incognita, a man who is willing to promise anything to get to office, and we're now faced with a challenge. Are we? After overcoming the initial shock of the election and coming out from under my covers, where I kind of thought I'd be for 4 years, I now want to engage in a more energetic way than ever before, using whatever platform I have to speak out, not for a particular candidate. I think we frankly need new blood in the Democratic Party, but for the core values which brought my parents here, and which my husband stood for, and which I stand for. The core values of tolerance and openness, and not condemning an entire group of people as a group, which really goes against the grain for us. And so I don't think we should sit out the next 4 years. I don't think that's the definition of a good citizen, is someone who just shows up every 4 years and casts a vote. I think we really have to stay engaged, and every single person in this room has a platform. And I have to say that social media has revealed its dark face in this election, and we have to clean that up before the next one, or we're not going to get anywhere, because demagogues can dominate the air and take all the oxygen out, and that's what we had happen.
Well, first of all, Allison, run to your book stand
Yes,
real quick.
you will be
You'll be
stormed.
there at the door. There are only 4 books left, right, or 5 copies. Secondly, I want to thank you, Kati, because this for me was the book of the year, because it's very unusual. I'm not being nice. I'm actually ruthless and mean. This story that you tell is one that I didn't know anything about, and I asked because not just the name Noel Field. I knew something. I was the first director of the Nixon Center in Washington. I knew something about Whitaker Chambers and Alger Hiss. I never knew of a Noel Field, and the story and the Stalin show trials, what it mattered, and also the issue of radicalization today has so many echo effects that continue to be important and contemporary. So, thank you for surprising me in a way I didn't think I could be surprised anymore. I really recommend it to everyone, and I often don't recommend books, even if I'm up doing a book event. So, Kati, thank you so much for your time. I know it was a journey to get down here, but thank you so much. Big round of applause for Kati Marton.